Language makes the world, or at the very least, it makes the world make at least some semblance of sense. If you try to think without language, for instance, you will absolutely break your brain. I just can't do it. Like maybe if I'm deep in meditation or something, the linguistic editorialization of reality ceases for a moment, but for the most part, I just can't do it. I can't think without language. It's like a genie you can't put back in the bottle. Terence McKenna, everybody's favorite psychedelic bard, has some of my absolute favorite riffs on this topic. For instance, he says, "Earth is a place where language has literally become alive. Language has infested matter. It is replicating and defining and building itself, and it is in us." I also have to mention this one. The problem is we have to transcend cultural languages and fall in phase with communication systems that nature has placed all around us. And this one. Cultures are virtual realities made of language. Not only are those some of my favorite wonder nuggets of his, they are apt appetizers for this mind meld with my wonder brother, James McCrae. But before we go any further, welcome, my friends. Glad to have you back in the mind meld. And if this is your first dip in the wonder drip, you chose a good one. Not only because James is a really singular, wonderful, whimsical, wise human being with a take unlike anyone else I've ever had on the podcast, but we also get into some of my absolute favorite topics: AI consciousness, psychedelics, the magic of language, of course, and just the wonder and weirdness at the root of reality in general. If you follow James on his Instagram page at Words Are Vibrations, you already have somewhat of an idea of what you're in for, but not entirely, because I think James' mind shines in podcast form, in long form, off the cuff, in a way that it can't quite on Instagram or in meme form. James is also the author of two lovely books, Shit Your Ego Says, and How to Laugh in Ironic Amusement During Your Existential Crisis. Pick them up wherever you procure your books. And with that, let's commence the Wonder Dip, my friends. But first, do tickle the algorithms on our behalf. Click like and subscribe here on YouTube. Comment. I do check them. I do my best to respond. So feel free to expand on your favorite riff in this mind meld. Also, do the necessary keyboard mudras or clicks to look up Third Eye Drops on your podcast platform of choice, as we have well over 300 mind melds published with all manner of multidisciplinary sages, the vast majority of which will never be published in video form on YouTube. You can also both support the show and participate on Patreon at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We have a patron-only Discord server where me and well over 100 other Wonder Dippers are rapping every day. We do Zoom hangs. We have a book club. Depending on your pledge level, I will send you technodelic trinkets like shirts, stickers, pins, and more, all at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. If you are already supporting in any of the above fashions, much love to you. Much appreciated. Psychic smooches. And with that, let us pierce the portal of this mind meld with my wonder brother, James McRae. James, my brother. Always wonderful to have you in the mind meld. I feel like every time we do it, there's always some kind of like weird novelty in the news. Like last time, I think like the war was just kicking off. This time AI is becoming sentient. So I like crossing these strange thresholds with you, man.
Absolutely. And to be fair, I think every day there's a huge news story. So if we could basically podcast on any given day and there would be something crazy in the news to break down.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't even like want to go down the doomsday path with you. That's actually one of my favorite things about you, is that you always manage to inject the mirth and the wonder into people's minds in a uniquely James way. And that's a lot more important to me than, well, maybe it's not more important to me than AI becoming sentient, but but in terms of what I think is salient to talk to you about, um, I want to say that I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, man. I have to be chronically optimistic. And part of that is just because there's so much pessimism in the world
Right.
right now that I want to balance that out in my own life. And also, I do believe that to a certain degree, the perspective that we bring into the world will help to inform our experience of what's happening. So I do, it's kind of like believing in God. It's like, well,
Mm.
whether or not that's true in any literal sense, the belief itself has
Mm.
benefits with how you perceive reality, which impacts your own happiness and well being. So I do think that speaking of
Yeah.
consciousness, the consciousness that we bring into the world has a big impact on our experience
Yeah.
of the world.
Yeah, so that's actually, you bring up an interesting philosophical quandary, which is that if you knew a certain belief, certain way of thinking would improve the quality of your life, but didn't necessarily believe it, would you choose that thing? And it sounds to me like maybe you would, like in the way that you talk about this idea of God. And by the way, I'm not bashing the idea of believing in God. I would say that if you cornered me and you said, "Do you think God exists?" I would say I think it's more likely than not, but then we would have to have a very nuanced conversation about what I mean by that and what I'm not sure about and what I think a lot of people project onto that concept. But what are your thoughts on that idea? Well, we can definitely just talk about God. I'm totally down with that. But what are your thoughts on this idea of like almost willfully deluding yourself with an idea to live a better quality of life? Is this something you're okay with, or is that not quite what you meant?
Well, I think it is an interesting question because I think the value is in any philosophy is in the utility of that philosophy and the
Hmm.
outcome it brings into your life. Like
Yeah.
a thought or a belief that's just a intellectual abstraction with no real world practicality doesn't have a lot of usefulness or value. So I would almost say that any idea is only as good as the value it can bring to your life or to the world. So if it's not true but you choose to believe it and it helps you in some way, maybe it is true. Because, and we've talked about this before, but the word true is a tough one.
Mhm.
And
Right.
there's definitely, like, I would say, like, lowercase t truth and uppercase t truth.
Yeah.
And I think most truths that we talk about are lowercase t truth. I think the uppercase t truths are unknowns that are beyond the human capacity
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah.
So if something brings you value in your life, it definitely has some truth to it. And whether it's literally true or not, I question the idea of literal truths in a lot of ways, and that circles back to the idea of God, because I've thought a lot about this. I did grow up in a religious environment, and
Yeah.
I absolutely believe in God, but I think the definition of God needs some major renovations.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's more like, what does that word mean? Like, is God
Exactly.
real or is God not real? Well, that's a lot to unpack. What do you mean
Yeah.
by God? Like,
Right.
do I believe in a old man in the sky? No. But I believe in consciousness. I believe in the life force that animates the human body, as well as blades of grass and
Yeah.
animals and
Yeah.
trees. what is this life force? That's
Well,
undeniably true. So I think God, for me, just is the existence of life and consciousness. Beyond that, it's a mystery.
yeah, yeah, I'm with you, and and you're the same way. I know that you're a big fan of embracing open-endedness, embracing almost like a mystical agnosticism where well, like as you're pointing to, there are things that just can't be known, at least by virtue of the human intellect. However, the closest ist or ism that I can't seem to escape is Platonism. And Platonism is not a religion, but it is a philosophy with core metaphysical, spiritual, immaterial underpinnings. And the obsession with logos is one of them. And logos, it's a lot of people, if they did come from a religious upbringing, will recognize, depending on what version of the Bible they read, like the very opening line of Genesis is like, "In the beginning was the logos," or "In the beginning was the word," and it's a complex topic and definition. It's a word with like something like 20 definitions or something like that. But it's the root of the word logic. It's also part of the word dialogue, dialogos. So it's
Hmm.
like coming together in the spirit of trying to understand and make well formed thoughts together with someone else to gain an insight into the world. And one of the things Plato tried to do is the core idea actually behind his dialogues was that most people at least have a foggy understanding of this platonic ideals, right? Like that there are these transcendent forms that live outside of our reality yet are connected to our reality. So there's actually a transcendently higher version of you. There's a
Hmm.
transcendently higher version of me. And Platonists say that our soul actually fell from this higher realm, like Plotinus specifically says that. I think we might have talked about soul fall before, this idea that our soul kind of got trapped in this lower shard reflection of itself. This is an idea that Plotinus talks about in the Enneads. But my point with this is saying that although I think I agree with you that I don't think we can know whatever this ultimate truth is, particularly from this standpoint that I find myself identifying with a lot. There's this fucking incredible quote that I heard. Um, and Plato said this in response to a rumored dialogue about truth that he had supposedly published but then denied, because he's saying like, no, the ultimate truth, whatever it is, I would never write a dialogue or participate in a dialogue on it because it can't be known, it can't be grasped. And this is what he said: except for in dialogue when two minds strike together like steel and flint and create a momentary spark, like a lightning flash of insight where you briefly get it and then it goes away. And that's one
Mm.
of the best descriptions I've ever heard, and something that makes me feel uh like maybe I'm doing something right as a podcaster, because
Yeah,
it's
he
like
was talking
this.
about podcasting. He's
Right, right.
literally describing those moments. Like every podcast has a moment where, like, it's like, oh, we figured out the truth. We figured out we solved all the world's problems in this one little dialogue. And for one momentary glimpse, everything seems to make sense. It's all clear. We reach that moment. Yeah, podcasting definitely does that.
And you know what the beautiful part about it is like it's almost like two parts of the divine, because that would be what we are platonically speaking, like two parts of the transcendent, like my consciousness and your consciousness, are coming about as close as they can get, through sharing ideas and trying to engage in this mutual understanding. And I find that just to be so beautiful and so nourishing.
That's really interesting. It almost reminds me of love.
Oh yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is.
Because if love, because like, we are each, isolated beings, but we are, we're all connected on some level in terms of like collective consciousness, and just the fact that all atoms are constantly just like moving around and changing places and becoming me and becoming you and becoming the table, etc. So there's definitely a connection between us all at some level, and love is where that connection is realized. So podcasting too, it's like maybe it doesn't matter as much the content of the conversation, right? Like, oh, we actually did solve something intellectually. Maybe it really is about that union of thinking or of spirit that comes
Hmm.
together to kind of form some level of connection, that connection itself is what the truth is.
Totally, man. Totally. Yeah, and this is of course another thing the Greeks were so much more precise with is they had all these different versions of love. They had eros, they had agape, they had philios. It's like, yeah, I think we've like lost so much in terms of linguistic precision. But you're totally onto something, man, because like the later Christian theologians really capitalized on this. Like Augustine and Aquinas, like they really were like especially Augustine, from what I remember, was really a Platonist. Like they referred to Plato all the time, and this is where a lot of their ideas, their metaphysics and ontology and all of these things, like so if you go back, if you were brought up Christian and you go back and you start reading Plato, you're going to find a lot of similarity. You're going to be like, this sounds familiar, and it's
Yeah.
not a coincidence. Like that, all of these like medieval Christian philosophers were heavily reading Plato and Aristotle, and that's where a lot of their underpinnings of their ideas came from. Like ideas like the Trinity, um, partially their obsession with logos, and also the relationship between God and love, like you're pointing to. Like these are all things that are heavily inspired by Platonism. So, um, all just to say that I think a lot of the beautiful aspects of Christianity are beautiful and really well formed out, for like thought out for a reason, because they're very old, they're very like, and they probably emanate from some kind of primary mystical experience, and all of that in my mind should be preserved, even though, like I said, I don't particularly associate with any historism at this point in time. But I do think that from like a perennial philosophy standpoint, there's something there.
Oh, it's all valid. And I think that one of the problems in our world today, of the many that we have, is the compartmentalization of discipline, right? Where you said that the early Christians were influenced by Plato. Well, where is that connection today? Philosophy is one camp, religion's another camp, science is another camp, mathematics is another camp, poetry is
Mhm,
another
mhm.
camp, right? Everyone is like entrenched in their discipline, and in a way that's isolated from the others. And it's kind of like what we just said about people being isolated, right? And it's the magic happens when you bring them together,
Yeah,
right? Whether it's in a conversation or a relationship. So there's so much value in trading notes.
right.
The mathematicians and the philosophers and the spiritualists and the poets, like there's so much interesting overlap and like connections to be made when we do that, because you can't look at the world from one lens and expect to see the whole picture. Like you can look at the world through a lens of poetry and like stay in that little zone. You can look at the world through a lens of science and like, even like a reductionist point of view, and none of them tell the whole truth. It's really when you can kind of combine them together and see the poetry in science, right? And
Yeah,
see how certain languages can say something in another way that adds a completely new context to it. So
Yeah.
there's so much value in trading notes and like um yeah, just
Yeah.
reclaiming some of the content that's been lost. I think there's so much we are so limited by our use of language, like you said, like the Greeks having multiple
Hmm.
words for love. And now it just doesn't cut it. And it's the same with God, you know. So often when I hear conversations between anyone and any kind of disagreement, it's because there's a misunderstanding of terminology, and there's
Right.
not even an
Totally.
argument in truth happening. There is a disagreement in what certain terms mean,
Totally.
right? And like that fundamental misunderstanding um creates huge problems, not only in people's lives but in the world. And that's why I think it's so important. And of course, I tend to look through the lens of language as a writer. That's kind of my primary modality of, understanding the world. So I think there's so much that language can do to heal the world
Yeah.
by saying things clearly, saying things. I often, one thing I've been saying a lot lately is that poets are the shamans of language.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
And what I mean by that is, what does a shaman do? A shaman is an energy healer. They have access to an energy field that they can go into, spiritually or energetically,
Yeah.
and they can look for where the energy is blocked. Where is the energy stuck? Where is it festering? Where is it creating sickness? Because a lot of sickness, in the shamanic tradition, can be traced to misalignment or
Yeah.
the stuckness of energy. So a shaman heals by finding those energy blockages and then clearing them out, all on the energetic plane, right? So poets, and when I use the term poet a little bit broadly because, you know, I think of memes as a form of poetry. There are different ways you can express poetry, but I think the essence of that is someone with an intuitive sense who is a writer can kind of tune into a problem in the world and like use language to kind of clear it out
Yeah.
and to kind
Yeah.
of find that higher truth,
Yes.
above
Yeah.
the conflict,
Yeah,
right?
re-inject the logos into where it's missing. The logic, the form, the nature, like because there is a disconnection. Like you're pointing to within language, there is all of this disconnection. There are all of these disagreements. And I think that, I use this term a lot in the show, mythopoetic drift. I also think there's linguistic drift happening where language is becoming sloppier. It's becoming less precise. People are using fewer words. And I would say that I would also add making up words as like an example of this, but I think that can assist as well. I think that can be a fun flourish as well because I think it can make things make more sense. I think there are things that we just don't have good words for yet that you might as well make words up for,
That
like
that's why I love slang and
yeah.
like
Yeah.
like Twitter language. Like people talk about like based and cringe. Like
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
those aren't necessarily new words, but like they're they've been injected into the dialogue on the internet in
Yeah.
particular to give a definition to things that were
Mhm.
previously undefined.
Yeah. No
And
cap,
suddenly
man.
we kind of get it, and we're like, oh,
No
I
cap.
totally understand what that means intuitively because this solves a problem that the previous words didn't adequately address.
Yeah. I said no cap twice while you were saying that. I guess I said it a third. Whatever. I got my point across. But um, I think that all of that. I think there's a place for all of that. But I also think there's a really, really vacant place for looking back on language and learning. I mean, I'm guilty of this. I don't really speak another language fluently, but I so badly want to, and I'm constantly encountering words in other languages that are just so amazing. Like there are these insane German words that I mean that's another culture with a really deep philosophical history. But there are these insane German words that are really like long and specific and crazy. Um, and then again, of course, Greek and Latin, and even the language I know the most other than English is Japanese. And I saw somebody I posted this the other day, just some really specific Japanese word that means like a I think it's a word that basically means like a Peter Pan child that like never grew up and something like a big long sentence to explain what the word means. And I love that stuff when you can express really specific um feelings that we've all had that we don't have good words for. That's
Yeah.
such an art.
Yeah, and it reminds me of even like emojis,
Yeah.
because you can use an emoji that says more precisely what you're trying to express than words can.
Yep.
And there's a
I'm
few
trying to find
reasons.
this Japanese word, so please continue. Yeah.
Yeah, just the visual component of an emoji that like it paints a picture. Like you could write something to that explains the emoji, but seeing the emoji adds an entire new emotion to it. And I think that is similar with memes. I think memes are a way of describing things that were previously not adequately described. Because how
Interesting.
often do you send a meme to a friend because it is just like articulating something very specific that previously
Yeah.
may not have been articulated quite that way. So I really am interested in the idea of memes as an evolution of language. And actually there's this there's this theory about the evolution of language and the written language coming into culture um at at the at as part of what we might call like the patriarchal like era, whereas before that language was more pictorial. And there's something about this linear logical way that written language is expressed that it favors you know logic and reason and art and like forming an argument. It's all very rational, whereas a pictorial language leaves more space around it, where it's less precise in some ways, but it's perhaps more precise in other ways. And
Hmm.
I think that memes are actually a return to a pictorial language. And of course, they use words, and it's a combination of words and images. Um, but in doing so and using that image, you can express way more than you can if you tried to type up an explanation of what that meme
Totally.
was saying. It communicates so much more in a one little JPEG than you could potentially do in an entire essay.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
do think that, and I think that we are we can only Terence McKenna said we can only evolve as a civilization as quickly as our language evolves, because we're kind of trapped by the paradigm of our language. So
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that memes do show a bit of a they point us forward a little bit into a by evolution the by creating an evolution in the language. It'll help direct an evolution of culture
Hmm.
and consciousness.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think sadly, the inverse is probably true that if your language is degrading, it's probably a sign that your culture is probably degrading as well. But I have more on this riff too. But so here's the word, by the way, this Japanese word is an example of just a strange, like, what? So it's chunibyo, chunibyo. A term typically used to describe early teens who have grandiose delusions, who desperately want to stand out and have convinced themselves that they have hidden knowledge or secret powers. It's like half the internet.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
That's like esoteric swag or something.
Right. Yeah, it's like spiritual materialism. It's spiritual egotism for sure. Um, but no, I think I really resonate with what you're saying, and the with the caveat being that I think what you were saying about language requires a very narrow view of what counts as language. Because if we're talking about English or a official nation language or ethnic group language, that may be true. But I heard this other amazing quote. Um, I think I may have written it down. Let me see if I can find it. I can't find it, but it was something I remember the gist of it, and it was basically, um, God wrote two scriptures, or no, God wrote two books. One was the scriptures, and the other was nature. So,
Mm.
so that I mean, that's another way to conceive of language, right? And it makes a lot of sense. Nature has rules. Nature has grammar. Nature has what I think you could argue is structure, like sentence structure, like a well written page in the book of nature is a being, right? It's layers of biology and chemistry and beauty and all of these things, and they work or they don't work. Like if you go into a lab and you don't understand all the languages necessary to clone an animal or inseminate someone through in vitro fertilization or something, it won't work, right? So I mean, this is language too. Like what isn't language? Like what in this world isn't language?
That's
It's a
interesting. Yeah.
hierarchy of languages. Like languages are facilitating this conversation that you and I are having right now through code, through uh, a stack of computer languages and protocols, and then there's cables coming out of your home conditioning electricity in a way that makes sure nothing blows up in the transformer down the street. It's like languages on top of languages on top of languages so that we can use this language to talk to each other. It's all
Man,
languages, man.
it reminds me of like, okay, here's a question. Would humanity be better off slash closer to the truth if we had never developed um like the written and spoken language? Like essentially, like let's
Yeah.
pretend like pretending we're all mute or can only express ourselves through, guttural sounds, and we cannot communicate through complex language the way we can today. Would humans be closer to knowledge and truth?
I think in a weird way, I think this question is kind of this. You're going to be like, what are you talking about? But in a weird way, I think this question is almost like, would we be better off if we didn't have guns? Because it's almost like a tool
Mm.
that is often misused. Maybe guns are a bad example because really all they do is kill stuff. But
Fire, maybe.
yeah, it's like a tool that can be misused and is often misused or used for extremely trivial exercises, but I do think again can be used for a uniquely type or a uniquely human type of understanding, like that Plato concept I talked about before, like two minds striking together like steel and flint, producing a spark of momentary understanding of the capital T truth. You can't
I
do that without language.
No.
Like there's a level of understanding I think you can share with a person, and there are certain, because in the same way that like math, you can only reach certain truths through logical structuring of complex ideas on top of complex ideas. I mean, even the very phenomenon, like the psychotechnology of language in general, is a fucking wild thing that the
Yeah.
brain has to like structure itself over the course of many years to even make sense. So I can't say we'd be better, though I do agree that I think it's like a jewel that we use to like wipe the asses of our psyches a lot of the time or something.
Yeah. Well, clearly we could not have nearly the level of like organized society that we have now, right? Um, saying, "Oh, go build this building,"
Right.
put it here, like you need language to organize, right? So clearly it's helped us tremendously in terms of organizing our society and building our society and allowing us to have things like a city, which requires so much of a synchronized complexity, right? So clearly it's useful, and it has a very, very strong utility for creating the kind of world that we have today. But I would also argue that so it has a very functional utility that helps us. When it comes to spiritual insight and even philosophy, I think we're actually going beyond the boundaries where language becomes useful,
Yeah.
because we're trying to apply a language to a concept that is where language does not adequately work, right? Because you can describe God, you can describe truth, you can describe these big concepts, and language falls short every time. And that's when we start to argue over terms and like my God versus your God, and this scripture versus that scripture, and this idea versus that idea, when they're all maybe just different ways of describing the same truth. So clearly, language has a a
Yeah.
strong utility when it comes to organizing and like doing certain things. But I think it's kind of like punching outside of its weight
Yeah.
class when
Yeah.
you're using language to describe the so-called metaphysical or the divine. It falls short.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you see this really on display with like modern academic philosophy, and not to attack anybody who does that for a living, because there's a lot of amazing, brilliant, tenured philosophers out there, but a lot of them too are really disconnected from anything practical that like matters to people on a on any kind of basis that's going to resonate. Like if you're like, and I should say, I mean, most of them would consider Platonism like an anachronism, like oh, that's not even like real philosophy. Like we talk about him in a historical sense. We don't talk about him in a real sense. And I would take huge issue with that, and I probably would lose a technical philosophical argument, but I think I would have a lot of great points to people that are just listening, that are looking for something practical, spiritual ideas that make sense. So I'll leave that there. But so there's another great Platonic riff on this topic that I posted something about the other day, and it's Plato divides knowledge into four different types. It's called his like divided line analogy or something. Um, he says the lowest form of knowledge is basic, and there's Greek words for all of these, and this is going to be an imprecise regurgitation, but this is the gist of it, is that the lowest kind is secondhand knowledge that you gain from an outside source. The next highest is direct experience. So you took it in with your senses. You saw it, you smelled it, you tasted it. It's like an animal kind of direct sensory knowing. The third kind of knowledge is logical quantitative knowing. So it's something that you can weigh, you can measure, you can prove, you can do a mathematical equation to show that it's real. The fourth kind is a direct insight into a form or an essence of a thing. And this is what we're talking about. This is where I totally
Mm.
agree. Language won't alone. Well, actually, though, that's kind of the point, I guess, from what I understand of his dialogues, is trying to get to the root of what is this concept that we all agree is a thing. Like you and I agree that love is a thing. What the fuck is it? Like let's really try to understand what it is. And can we get to a place of direct insight into the nature of love through a really meaningful conversation where we're both trying our hardest to really gain an insight? I think so. But then again, his point about not being able to capture the capital T truth with language, with a dialogue, I think that stands too. So I think you're right, man. I think there is a place where at least this kind of language runs out, runs out of its ability,
Totally. And it reminds
utility.
me, it makes me think about like intuition and where does that fit into the world of knowledge? Because we all have senses of things, right? And the brain can be tricked. I've come to really not put a lot of not a lot of not that I say I don't put a lot of importance or weight on the brain, because the brain is obviously very useful, but I do consider it a little bit secondary to, I would say, feeling slash intuition slash felt sensation.
Mm,
And I think about this as a creative, and I try to really dissect where how my creative process happens and where my ideas come from. Because we think of ideas like, where does an idea come from? Like it pops into your head, like it's not there, and then suddenly it's there. Like it's like the Big
yeah.
Bang. It's like it just suddenly happens, and then then you're off to the races. So how does that process take place? So I've
Hmm.
I've really tried to like slow down my own creative process to like figure out how it works. And what I've come to notice is that for me, creativity does not start in the mind, it starts as a feeling. And I think that I've come to realize that thought is downstream of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So I begin my creative process by just tuning into my body and like trying to figure out how I'm feeling and what I'm feeling. And like, don't let, I'm not thinking, I'm just feeling. I'm like, do I feel discomfort in any certain way? Do I feel excitement in any certain way? Like, what is the core feeling that is happening in me right now? And then like a sense comes through, just kind of a sense of something. And then once that a certain sense comes through, then my mind can start to study that sense and to maybe start to make some intellectual sense of it.
Yeah.
And then I can like start to apply words to it. But my best work, my best writing comes when I sit in that sensation and dwell in it, and then later extrapolate it into thought and into words. But it arises out of like a bodily sense. So I've come to understand that there is an intelligence in the body, in feeling, in emotion, and there's information there. Now that information doesn't speak English. It speaks it speaks like to the nervous system. It speaks to our emotion. But I think that's closer to source, closer to truth. So I think you know, it's actually upstream of where our thoughts come from. So it's a little bit closer. So I try to like focus on that and let that guide me. And then my mind can basically,
Hmm.
help navigate.
Yeah.
But I think without that connection to the body, without that connection to emotion, you're just working with a mental or intellectual abstraction, which is kind of, being ego driven, or,
Hmm.
which is just, it's not like it's wrong in any like moral sense. It's just an incomplete navigational system.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so. I guess I just have to say that everything I'm thinking of lately is coming from a Platonic place, but it reminds me of, when he's talking about his idea of the soul and the soul being like three different parts. He does place the rational mind at the highest point. However, what I actually think he agrees with you in that, to him all of these things you're talking about, like feeling your body and trying to get in direct contact with whatever you're feeling, or the impulses coursing through you, is actually more rational than trying to abstractly think about something. Because when you're trying to abstractly think about something, you're levying judgment on it. You're doing egotistical acts of value judgment and weighing and measuring, and that's actually a lower kind of like part of the rational mind or the soul. Like now you're getting into the more animal realm, and I think that if you want to get closer to that truth, you have to dispel the things that condition your thinking. So the things where you're thinking in a self-referential, egotistical way, those things I totally agree they block you. And I think an easier way to say it is maybe it would be like heart-based thinking instead of brain based thinking. But again, I think that that gets kind of complex and imprecise. And I would rather say that it's like a cleaner part of the psyche. It's a cleaner part of the psyche before it's conditioned by value judgments, or by, is this good? Is this funny? Is this interesting? Like you got to get past that and get to the place of pure signal. Like, because if you get to the place of pure signal, it's 100% valid because everyone feels it, everyone knows it. It's like that, the more core level language of emotion and of humanity that we all experience, and it's only you only fuck it up by trying to think too hard about it. Like the closer you, like the cleaner you can blast it out, like, right, the simpler, the cleaner, the more direct, the
Yeah,
more you're guaranteed to have it resonate.
I'm with you. Yeah, and that is, it kind of gets back to love as well. As one way of describing love would be, that which connects us. I often think of it as it's a magnetic force that
Yeah.
actually connects us. And when when I'm writing and I tune into my felt sensation, I believe that I'm closer to tapping into a collective experience, because I think that we are connected in different ways,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
we're more connected with our kind of felt experience than we are with our intellectual interpretation of that felt experience. I think that often, people that share a culture, in terms of like, we're all affected by more or less the same news, the same laws, the same, just happenings. Um, there is some kind of a symbiotic relationship, and I think that relationship exists on some kind of a felt, level, and the level of the nervous system, the level of emotion. So when I tune into that, that is when I come up, and then I let my mind kind of interpret that and write words with it. But because it's based in a felt sensation, it's more likely to 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 resonate with a greater number of people, because we all are connected through feeling, not through thought. We all, our minds all interpret things a different way. But when you can be, as when it's based in just that gut sense, you, the reader or the viewer of your art may not necessarily completely understand or resonate with like the content of the words, but they will find their own experience in the feeling of it. That's why like they say like some of the best advice for writers is to just go as deep as possible into your own experience. And you might think, well, my experience is my experience. Um, no one else is going to find that interesting. But the more the more deep you dig and the more honest you are, they might not relate to the exact details of your experience, but they're going to find something because you went
Hmm.
deep.
Yep.
They're gonna it's gonna trigger something within themselves on that same level of depth. So the feeling is what connects us. And I love what you said. You know, one of my favorite writers and mentors is the poet Allen Ginsberg. And one of his credos, which he learned from Jack Kerouac, is first thought, best thought. So Ginsberg's poetry was an attempt to free poetry from the kind of confines of tradition and formula, and to pull directly from the subconscious. And some of his poetry is a little bit unreadable, or it's like a little bit difficult to digest, because it really was like a direct mind dump.
Yeah. Stream of
And then
consciousness.
and that was he was attempting to bring out the subconscious onto the written page, including all of his darkest fears and insecurities and fantasies, and in doing so, kind of purging them from the subconscious. And then what that does on a collective level is it helps to purge it from all of us, because someone else will read it and be like, wow, he has permission to say that, which gives me permission to say that. And it's liberating in a sense to kind of expel our demons by getting them out of the body, out of the subconscious, and then dumping them onto the page. And in doing so, you're going to tap into nuggets of truth that, if you are overly polishing your work, or overly censoring yourself, or overly editing yourself, it wouldn't come through as clearly. And in fact, I just read an interview with Ginsberg recently that was very interesting. The interviewer asked him, "Do you polish your poetry much? Like, when it comes out, do you then polish it to edit it?" And his response was, "No, hardly at all. But I polish my mind prior to writing it." So his whole creative process
Mm.
was to get into a place of meditation where he could open up that channel, where it would be so clear that what came through was exactly what needed to be said without editing.
Yeah.
Just like lowering the barrier between, writer and reader, and kind of creating a portal of consciousness that can connect them together. Um, just like the love that we've been talking about, forming that connection, um,
Yeah.
between us all.
Hmm. I love that, man. I gotta go get my cat because she's just like bashing at the door. So I'll be right back.
All right.
Did he give any indication of what that process was like? His clearing, his preparation process for receiving that information, or maybe I'm projecting that word onto him, but for like cleansing his mind, or polishing his mind.
Yeah, I think it was a basic form of meditation, or um, precise awareness of your own thoughts, which I think is a
Mm,
result of meditation and mindfulness.
okay.
Like, paying attention to, it's just like when in meditation, kind of the goal isn't necessarily to stop thinking. The goal is to become aware of your thoughts, and kind of recognize the different types of thoughts you might have that might come about, and like, what is
Hmm.
their origin. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm hungry because I feel that in my stomach, or I'm afraid of something because of something that happened to me. So it's really about mindfulness, which is it's basically hyper awareness of your own subconscious and tuning into that. So
Hmm.
he was, like a user of psychedelics and things like that. I don't
Yeah.
think I'm necessarily like overly so. I don't think that was like necessarily his go-to. I think just simple classic Buddhist meditation was his go-to methodology for, so-called polishing the mind.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Because there's the, there's the classic metaphor of polishing the mirror. And I think too that most people who are meditators in the Eastern Buddhist sense wouldn't characterize it this way, but I think there's something here, is that I think those practices help you burn off the psychic weather in a way where it's like it all builds up throughout the day, right? Like these thoughts, these ideas, it really is like cloud cover. And I've said this before too, that um I think I said this to Corey in one of our podcasts, that I'm kind of tired of the your thoughts are clouds in the sky idea, because I think some of them are substantially more aggressive than that. I think many of them have like a gravity, or they're almost like they're trying to like fucking eat your mind, like the anxiety, depression, like these are not just dark clouds, these are like tornadoes. These are like trying to suck you in. But I do think that if you get in the habit of occupying the stillness from a completely subjective and judgment free open posture, that these things do eventually wear themselves out, and you get better at recognizing them and allowing them to wear themselves out more quickly, though not always. But I think there is something to this, and I don't want to make it sound like, yeah, meditate for inspiration, because I don't think that's the point, or I think it's almost like a secondary um it's like saying work out to, you know, get ripped or something. It's like, yeah, you might get ripped, but really you just like you're doing it, you should be doing it for health and to keep your mind and your body well, like that's really the primary thing, and then anything on top of that is sort of like a secondary uh aspiration, or it should be. But I do think that there's something to this idea that as you develop a practice like that, you get better at seeing through that fog, seeing through the clouds, where you at least develop like a way of recognizing those. And then by recognizing those, you also get familiar with like the spaciousness and like the negative space that is not those things. And once you become aware of that spaciousness, then I think that's when you start like getting a clearer pings of insight, like clearer, almost, I don't want to say transmissions necessarily, but maybe, you something clears up. And this is again, fucking go to Plato, is one of the core, and I'm so curious what this actually was, because we don't know what his inner teachings were. There was an inner circle at his academy, and there were unwritten teachings and initiations, and we don't know what they were. But he does talk somewhat about, and Plotinus does talk somewhat about this thing they called catharsis. And catharsis, they said, was burning off um, these illusions, and like basically like burning off parts of your ego and preoccupations and obsession with worldly things. Like this was a core part too. Like, so you again, and for them, for the Platonists, the whole idea was to elevate your mind to the level of the divine mind. I don't know if I said that. So that was the kind of bottom line for them. But I really think it all kind of gels together.
Yeah, I think it is a transmission. I like that word. That's what I notice in my own work in terms of like that intersection of meditation and mindfulness and creativity. But creativity is not just for art; it's for creative thinking. It's for independent thinking, insight into situations beyond what it was formerly there. I think these are all, that's what creativity ultimately is. We talk about creativity in terms of making art, but creativity is really just access to insight and independent thinking. So for me, that comes from where I call the space between my thoughts. So I often think that there are ideas out there. There is knowledge out there.
Mhm,
There are,
mhm.
you could call them the Platonic ideals. I'm not opposed to the idea that there are, we know that we live in the third dimension. We have, three dimensions around us, four if you count time, and we know that there's a second dimension, which is, a drawing on a piece of paper. It's two dimensions. So I'm open to the idea, and I think that science is open to the idea now of multiple dimensions.
Yeah, yeah.
And um but it's possible that we exist on multiple dimensions at the same time,
I
and
think we
we can
absolutely
access
do.
them. And I think that intuition is, to a degree, a form of accessing information that exists in other dimensions. Sorry, my dog's barking.
Yeah, let's just give them a second. So,
Most likely it's a package being delivered.
oh, that makes sense.
They go crazy. All
So,
right, so we're
okay, yeah, what were you just saying?
so I do think it's feasible that we exist on multiple dimensions at the same time, and intuition is a portal between dimensions.
I like
And
that.
there is information that exists on higher levels than the conscious mind has access to, and the intuition is like a little portal where that information can slip through, and that's where there's a moment of insight. And it's so important to balance that insight with the rational ego mind, right? Of course, there's like the stereotype of the spaced out hippie who has taken way too much acid and their mind is in the clouds, and they are a direct channel to all kinds of cosmic illumination, but they can't do a damn thing with any of the information because they don't have a strong enough functioning ego to make sense of it all. So yes, you can have intuition, you can meditate all day, and you can have access to great insights. But and then I think that's when it's the ego's job to take that insight and to craft it into a way that makes sense. So that's what people say, like, oh, I have a hard time getting my ego out of the way when I'm being creative. And one of the things that I say is that, well, tell your ego that it has a very important role to play, just not yet.
Mm,
Because you need to be in that open space of intuition and imagination. And in that sense, having that busy ego being like, what about this? What about this? Is not necessarily helpful. So just reassure your ego and tell it, listen, you're going to have an important role to play in this process, just not yet. Once you can kind of once you start to feel inspired, once you start to like intuit certain ideas, then that's the that's all fodder for the ego's
mhm.
playground to start like using that rational mind to
Yeah,
for it to
sculpt.
be
Yeah.
translatable to an audience of some
Mhm.
sort.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I just kept thinking of the word sculpt. Like, there's this part
Yeah,
of the ego that just wants to sculpt. It's like,
exactly.
it's like you get this avalanche of ideas or something, and it immediately wants to just start sculpting. You're
Yeah,
like, chill out. I haven't even picked a rock yet, man. Like, I
totally.
got to let me work on picking a rock, and then you can sculpt away.
But when I'm editing, it's like it's all ego mind. The whole thing is hyper criticism. When I'm
Right,
editing, it's like what can I cut? Like I'm
right.
scanning it with from a
Yeah.
very critical place.
Because
So
because at that point you're serving aesthetics, right? You're serving the
yeah,
aesthetic of like, how can I best present this thing? And I think people look at that process as a kind of like critical or impure. Like even in the Allen Ginsberg, you know, sense, it's like, oh, let the raw thing out there. But I think I don't know, man. I'm not that to an extent. I'm that way. But what I really want is I want the essence of the thing to come through, and I will put however much work into that I think it requires. It's like It doesn't mean I do a good job, doesn't mean I don't over edit, doesn't mean I don't under edit, but I think in my heart of hearts, that's what I want. I want the essence of the thing to come through, and I don't want to do any more or any less than that.
Right. Yeah, so maybe like art is a way of bringing these platonic ideals into fruition. It's playing
Yeah,
around with a higher level of order, and
yeah,
it's manifesting it on the 3D plane.
I
And
agree.
and I
Yeah,
often say, like, I really think creativity is a spiritual modality and a healing modality. I think that there's so much usefulness. Like, not everyone relates to deep, abstract, esoteric, spiritual ideas or rituals or practices. Even, if I ever find myself in some kind of a spiritual like event or something, and there's all this stuff going on, and everyone's like high vibing it, it's like I have no problem with that, but I'm not. That's not entirely my zone, right? And I think that it can be um exclusive an exclusive club in a lot of ways.
oh yeah,
And I've come to accept that creativity is my personal spiritual path, and the creative process is a spiritual ritual.
yes,
And that's why I have, around my room, I've got relics from my favorite artists, whether I've got like a first edition Bob Dylan poetry
cool,
book, like a signed Patti Smith book, a first edition Prince vinyl from the early 80s. Like,
yeah.
I put the stuff
You-
around my room as like
yeah,
my own little deities in the creative world.
I love that because you're carrying it's you've identified what torch you're carrying in doing that. Like you've identified this is the torch that I want to try to carry forward in my work. I want to try to like take that spirit and put it through the lens of my own psyche and try to add something to that. And I think that's a really powerful way to approach creativity for sure.
Yeah, I think it's important to have, the idea of a guru is an interesting one. And I'm not a fan of gurus, but I know people in my life that like that idea and that believe in that idea. And we've talked about this, and they've told me that, well, the point of a guru is because you can get to get any type of truth, you need to receive it from someone who has been there. And like, there are a lot of lineages that are sturdy because they've proven themselves over, centuries or, more. So I think you don't need to have a guru in a sense of like worshiping anyone, certainly, but I think there's a lot of value in knowing what your lineage is, and
Mm,
knowing, like, if you're an artist, like, what are the
yeah,
what artistic lineage are you following? If you're a philosopher, like, what,
totally.
obviously you can innovate the lineage you're supposed to. You're not supposed to rehash things, but what spirit are you taking, like, the torch to kind of carry it forward into
Hmm.
the future? None of us
Absolutely.
exist in isolation. We're all, um we pick up ideas from all over the place, and we can remix them, and we can add to them. We can take this and this and put them together. But I think it's really helpful to know, like, okay, whose legacy are you continuing
Yep.
to push forward, and what do you represent in terms of, like, from a historical perspective?
Yeah, and to find out what really resonates with you. Like not just what you perceive to be cool, not just what you perceive to be um the quote unquote right answer, but what really feeds your soul when you're reading it, when you're hearing it, when you're like trying to really fully grok their ideas. Have we talked about James Hillman's um find out what tree you're on riff?
No, I don't think so. You've told me about James Hillman, but I haven't done any exploration yet. So I think that would
Oh
be
man.
totally new for me.
Yeah, so it's kind of another way of saying precisely what you're saying is that, you may not be like having Bob Dylan hand you the torch, and be like, you're the next guy. But in assembling these complementary ideas and figuring out that you belong in the interplay of those ideas and your place is in the interplay of those ideas and continuing to express and remix and add to those ideas, that's what he means by finding out what tree you're on. Like he would say that he was on the tree of Carl Jung and Plato and Goethe, um, and people, these kind of like mythopoetic visionaries. And when I heard him say that, I'm like, oh shit, I'm on your tree. So that
Yeah.
was like what kind of sealed the deal for me loving James Hillman. But but yeah, I love that because it's not like you're dogmatically attached to these people and you have to vouch now for everything they ever did or said, like, but it's like you resonate with their ideas, and those ideas are important in formation of your own ideas.
Yeah. And often they need to be renewed and redeemed, right?
Mhm.
Because obviously look at any era in history and it's problematic in some way, right? So
Yeah,
having some kind of a guide or an influence or recognizing some kind of a lineage, that does not mean that anyone was perfect or that their thinking was perfect. You could look at anyone in history and identify something fucked up about what they believed because we're all products of our time. So
right.
it's not like you're giving anyone like a full endorsement. It's more like what is that nugget of truth that these people were um you know pulling out of the
Yeah,
ether
that yeah, yeah,
and bringing forward. And it's so useful just to clarify your role in the world. Like for me, you mentioned some of those thinkers. For me, it's the writers, like it's the kind of mystical
mhm,
poets from William Blake to Walt
yeah,
Whitman to
mhm,
Ginsberg. I think like Bob Dylan and even like Patti Smith and um people like that are it's kind of the and we're and everyone kind of takes a message or takes the torch and they adapt it to their own
yeah,
world. And it's just so important to have to be grounded in some type of tradition or lineage, because I think that things hold up over time for a reason. It's like having like like you look at the pyramids, look at the Sphinx, look at like the some of the great Roman
yeah,
cathedrals or whatever. Um, things that stand the test of time because they're built well. That applies to different ways of thinking as well, right? Like
totally,
what did your great grandparents, where did they find truth? Right? It's worth looking at that and not dismissing it, because um it whatever worked for them and the people that came before them and the people before them, um there's something sturdy to kind of set a foundation on, that then you can innovate to your heart's content and shape it any way you want. But it's gonna be have a little bit more of a foundation to it.
totally, man. Yeah, I don't care who you are. You came into the world mushy and I mean, think about it, as a baby, you literally come into the world mushy and sloppy and unformed, right? And as you become adult, you might start to think that you've got it figured out, and that you've got something to say if you're an artistically inspired person or a talented person, but you don't even have any idea how sloppy and mushy you still are at that point, and how much better you could get if you were willing to look back at all of those things that came before. And like we're saying, find your tree, because now you've equipped yourself with like a wellspring of inspiration that's going to unlock your uniqueness in a way you didn't even think was possible until you came into contact with these, you know, thinkers that are on your tree that came before you, that were geniuses of their own time and of their own kind. And yeah, I'm with you, man. I think that's so important. I think that that's something that our generation and younger is really guilty of, is that we're so caught up in the novelty and the newness and the shiny thing that it becomes really difficult to go back and because you got to slow down, man, to
Yeah.
digest even, you know, philosophical ideas that I think are really fun, like Plato. You got to slow down, you got to read some stuff, you got to listen to some long shit, you know, like a lot of times before it starts to click and make sense. And that's getting harder and harder to do because of the the finitude of the attention span and the way that we consume things. It's so tempting to not ever do the deep dive, but you got to do the deep dive. You got to do the deep dive.
Yeah, you really yeah, doing your homework. Like it's really important to like whatever area you're interested in, if it's literature, if it's music, if it's philosophy. I I I love there's this kid at the grocery store that I go to. He's a young man, and he's got a new philosophy book, like a deep philosophy book with him at the register every time I go in. And
Cool.
when there's not customers, he's like reading Nietzsche or like whatever.
Hmm.
And then I always chat with him about what he's reading. And I'm like, God bless you, man, because you're doing the work. Like, um, yeah, it helps to clarify your own position to do the homework, and um, you just it helps to clarify your own point of view and find your own voice. You know,
Yeah.
you kind of need to know what's going on around you, and it's kind of like understand. Like I think it's that this is the reason why why the idea of archetypes have become
Hmm.
once again popular in recent years, because there are these somewhat, as much as we can have universal truths built into the structure of humanity, there are these recurring themes
Hmm.
that come up in society again and again. Every generation has certain, you know, archetypal figures that
Yeah.
arise. And when you can see the pattern, you start to understand kind of not only what's going on, but what's your role in this, you know, this worldwide play that's being acted out,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
And you can kind of like see the pieces, and it just gives you more of a an elevated view on how this the whole drama of life is unfolding.
Yeah, yeah, man. I think thinking archetypically in that way too is another way to glimpse into what might be forms, or what might be closer to forms that just don't go away, like these mythological motifs. Like again, they're like these linguistic substructures or foundations that just don't go away. It's like you read the Bhagavad Gita, it's there. You read Homer, it's there. You know, there's like similar ideas across cultures, and I think these are real features of the human psyche that have been there all along. I'm totally with you, man. Totally with you. We've done a big old lap, brother. Did you have something you were about to riff on there?
No, man, I just no, I did did we reach the point where the truth was briefly for one, you know, one glimpse broken through the clouds of
Well,
thought and shown into the three-dimensional world of space and time?
I don't know. I mean, well, I think the listeners will have to decide. I would never say that. Um, I would never claim to be capable of such a feat, though I will say I would suspect that one of the features of doing that is a kind of like time nullification, where because I remember looking at the clock somewhere around 30 something minutes, and now it's like an hour and 20 almost. So there's something to that, I think. We time traveled. We, at the very least, we time traveled.
Well, in a literal sense of time moving forward, we certainly did.
And for all I know, maybe this was crawling for you. I don't know, but it wasn't for me.
No, I'm kidding.
What do you have going on? Anything you want to tell people about?
Yes. So I am running a meme school at the end of July. So this is going to be my second time running a course on all things memes. So the first it's a 1 week course that's going to cover the science of memetics and how ideas spread and how certain ideas go viral across a culture. We're going to talk about the internet meme, the evolution of the internet meme over time, and then lastly, and most importantly, how to actually make your own memes in terms of how to actually come up with the ideas, what tools to use to make them, and then ultimately how to grow a following online through creative formats like memes. So that's coming up at the end of July, and um, you can go to my Instagram at Words Are Vibrations to learn more about that.
Love it, man. That's such a good idea. I'm glad you're doing that. That's perfect.
Meme school, yeah.